Good morning, everybody on the platform, and a warm welcome to this ENACT webinar. As we all know that ENACT is about enhancing Africa's response to transnational organized crime, and it is implemented by the Institute of Security Studies, Interpol, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and is funded by the European Union. Mine is to chair this session and to just give the house rules. Firstly, we won't have the Chatham rules applying. And also please mute your microphones, those who are not on the platform. And at the end of the presentations, we'll ask everybody on the platform, including those on YouTube and Facebook who have joined us, to fill in the evaluation form. It's very important, please. We will have the presentations and we will have simultaneous interpretation, English and French languages. Please make use of the relevant facilities for purposes of interpretation. Perhaps let me just start off by quoting the late Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, in his foreword to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and the protocols thereto. He said the following: criminal groups have wasted no time in embracing today's globalized economy and the sophisticated technology that goes with it. But our efforts to combat them have remained up to now very fragmented, and our weapons almost obsolete. This convention gives us a new tool to address the scourge of crime as a global problem. With enhanced international cooperation, we can have a real impact on the ability of international criminals to operate successfully and can help citizens everywhere in their often bitter struggle for safety and dignity in their homes and communities. Now, we do have this instrument, international instrument at our disposal, which was signed in December 2000 in Palermo, Sicily, in the belly of mafia in 2000, which on its own was quite a significant event, the signing of this UN convention, because the whole world was sending a message to organized crime. Of course, we know that this took effect only in 2003. Now, almost 21 years later, it is important for all of us to make an assessment as to the efficacy and effectiveness of this tool, this instrument that we have at our disposal, and look at our performance as the region, as the continent of Africa. How we've been able to make use of this tool, how we've been able to complement the efforts of the international community in the implementation of UNTOC. Now, I'm looking forward to hearing from all the esteemed panelists who will be making presentations based on their practical experiences and expertise. We know that we still have to, deal with the inequalities that exist globally. The disparity in resources and expertise. And for us to be able then to mount a serious offensive against transnational organized crime, given the fact that crime knows no borders, but we are often constrained and restrained by our national borders in trying to secure our cooperation at a global scale. Africa is always at the receiving end of not being assisted when seeking mutual legal assistance from the global community, when seeking to extradite those who have committed crimes in Africa, but have been able to flee to other countries outside of Africa. It's often said that because of prison overcrowding in Africa, because of our inadequate legislation in Africa, because of our inefficiencies in trying to implement some of the laws, it's difficult for other countries to cooperate and collaborate with African states when seeking to extradite those who might have fled to other countries. And also when we seek mutual legal assistance, we always are met with all sorts of problems. Therefore, this gives us an opportunity to have an evaluation of what we have, what we do not have, what is it that we need to put in place, how do we cooperate amongst ourselves across borders so as not to frustrate efforts as we try to combat transnational organized crime. We hope that through this webinar, we'll be able to hear from our experts, from our researchers and analysts as to how do we then strengthen our legislation, how do we strengthen our efficiencies, how do we strengthen administrative support, because it's one thing to have good laws, but administratively we are weak. We're looking forward to hearing about Article 16 when it comes to those countries which might not be having extradition arrangements with other countries, because again, the tool we have at our disposal, UNTOC, it requires flexibility in making sure that where there is no treaty, then people can have regard to UNTOC. And also when it comes to Article 18 of the convention itself, when it comes to mutual legal assistance, which is often regarded as a mini treaty on its own. Without further ado, we'll have to start then our program. May I also ask our esteemed panelists to please keep to their time so that we can have a fruitful engagement. As I call upon Olwethu to make a presentation, which will last for about 15 minutes. May I please hand over to you, Ms. Olwethu Majola. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Advocate. Let me just share my screen. Okay, welcome and thank you very much, Advocate, for our very insightful introduction. So in my presentation today, I will be discussing a paper that was published in June 2023 entitled Measuring the Treatment, the UNTOC in Africa. This paper was an ambitious project that was aimed at assessing whether UNTOC was having an impact on organized crime on the African continent. So in this presentation, I will just be providing some analysis and recommendations that came out of that study. So as we begin this presentation, we remind ourselves of Article 1 of the UNTOC, which states that the purpose of the convention is to promote cooperation in the prevention and combating of transnational organized crime. However, we ask ourselves the question, do we know whether this objective is being achieved in Africa? And if so, to what extent? So this presentation will shed some light on this question. So why exactly did we embark on the study? The study was conducted to determine whether UNTOC's adoption and implementation was actually affecting criminal markets and state resilience to organized crime in Africa. Organized crime, as we all know, remains a big problem in Africa, and linking its implementation to its impact on the ground almost does not have any research or analysis tied to it at the moment. The UNTOC review mechanism was also not going to be an avenue through which we would find this information out, as it only looks at the implementation of the instrument. In terms of the methodology, how did we go about our study? We had a data set that was comprised of 3 main data sources, and that was the UNTOC's ratification information, the Africa Organized Crime Index, as well as the resilience and criminality scores tied to the Organized Crime Index. And supporting a lot of the analysis was academic literature that we consulted. However, this was also very limited. What do we know from the UNTOC and the Organized Crime Index when it comes to the implementation of the UNTOC and its possible impact on organized crime markets in Africa? Well, we began by conducting a comparative analysis of ratification status, time of ratification, and then comparing this data to criminality scores as well as resilience scores across the continent. What we did see was that there is widespread ratification in Africa, which indicates a political will for implementation, although over time this may have been lost. And despite, for example, early adoption in countries like Cameroon, we see that regardless of whether the state had adopted the UNTOC early or not, criminality remains to be, is amongst the higher, Cameroon is amongst the highest scoring countries. Organized crime also seems to have increased based on the Organized Crime Index over the 2019 and 2021 period, despite widespread ratification in Africa. And if we look at the 2023 results of the Organized Crime Index, we see slight improvements, but none are really worth mentioning, as they still remain below 1 point, for example, in countries like Niger, Ghana, and Namibia. And then what is the state of international cooperation? As we have just discussed, according to Article 1, this is the main objective of the instrument. We see that there is a lack of reported data, and only 10 states, for example, in formal documents such as the UNODC's Digest of Cases, seemed to report on international cooperation, and as well as other mediums for such as mutual legal assistance. We see that in these types of documents report inadequate case management systems, and that the finalization of cases is quite slow due to bureaucracy and litigation. We see that a large number of mutual legal assistance requests are returned unprocessed due to a failure to meet requirements. And then we also see there are some challenges around human rights spheres, where in certain countries requests are not processed due to fears that the sanctions or punishments that are imposed would not be constitutionally appropriate. So we also see in the data that a lot of technical assistance is coming into the continent through the facilities such as the UNODC's dialogue between WACAP and Eurojust, as well as a number of other facilities that are provided to promote cooperation in responses to trafficking and wildlife crimes. So as we proceeded with our analysis, we found ourselves unable to actually make a correlation between ratification and implementation, and whether this is having any effect on criminal markets and state resilience. Largely, we were faced with a gap in information because there is limited reporting by African states, and there was not enough information to determine how widely the UNTOC was actually being implemented. Information on international cooperation, mutual legal assistance, and extradition was also fragmented and scattered, and was available in various documents in bits and pieces, for example, through the Factors Mutual Evaluation Reports, UNODC's websites, and limited coverage of high-profile cases. And we also noted that the Organized Crime Index would not be able to help us in measuring impact, as it only is limited to measuring the effects on criminal markets and state resilience. We therefore found there was too much of a methodological jump for us to actually make conclusions on UNTOC's implementation and how it is affecting criminal markets on the ground. So what can we tell from what we know? So from what we know now, we can tell that the UNTOC is, we cannot really say whether UNTOC is reducing criminal markets. The initial data points to UNTOC not having an impact on the ground at the very best. Also, it may be too early for us to determine whether the UNTOC is working, as we do not have enough data to determine this. So also at this stage, it may be possible to measure the extent of implementation, but it is not yet possible to measure a direct relationship between UNTOC's implementation and its impact on criminal markets. And in terms of the UNODC's digest of cases, we see that the UNTOC is actually not being used by member states, and also at the regional level through the AU, ECOWAS, EAC, etc. At the very least, we can tell that there is a lack of accountability or disclosure. What data are we missing at the moment? How do we close this gap in information? In addition to needing a methodology to linking UNTOC's implementation to impact, one would suggest an initial step, which would be to collect as much data as possible, perhaps through a central repository into which member states and development partners could input the following information related to domestic and international legislation and agreements that have been put in place, the outcomes of requests for mutual legal assistance, as well as how many of these requests are sent out, how many investigations and prosecutions are initiated and concluded, international cooperation networks and frameworks that exist and making these more widely known, capacity building activities and keeping track of activities by development partners to avoid duplication. Also, criminal markets and state resilience data from the Organized Crime Index could be inputted into this data pool, as well as case studies of the criminal markets, countries, and other areas and issues of concern that may come about. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Olwethu. The presentation was based on a research paper by ENACT measuring the efficacy of UNTOC in Africa. I must say that it's a bit concerning. It means some work still needs to be done to make sure that we've got all the necessary data that will be able to equip us, you know, and inform us exactly as to what is it that we still need to do and to get. Thank you very much, Olwethu. Now let's move over to Mr. Charles Goredema on MLA and extradition in Africa. Over to you, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Advocate Pikoli, and thank you to ENACT for inviting me to, I'm just trying to share my slide presentation. We'll just put it in full mode here. Can everyone see? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can see it, Charles. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, thank you. My research, which was at the invitation of ENACT, really complemented the work that Olwethu had already started doing. It resulted in me putting together my thoughts on evaluating the effectiveness of MLA and extradition in Africa, which in essence was really an assessment of the effectiveness of the entities who are seeking or activating these two methods of dealing with cross-border crime. The main points that are made in the paper, which you will be able to access, are firstly that there's unanimity that cross-border organized crime is a real threat to development. And the most pernicious forms of cross-border crimes are those that call into question the efficacy of the collaborative mechanisms that various states have put in place, partly through the instrumentality of the UNTOC and partly through the respective regional instruments that they put together. UNTOC and these instruments at a regional level are intended to be the source of common frameworks for strategies and operational approaches to cross-border organized crime. Whether that is, in fact, what is happening is, of course, the question that I sought to answer. Other main points made in that paper are that the utilization and effectiveness of MLA and extradition need to be assessed. But for now, this was not happening. It was only happening in a rather indirect way through assessments of the effectiveness of implementation of anti-money laundering and combating terrorist financing measures, which are happening at the instance of the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, and its various regional affiliates, such as the Eastern Southern Africa Anti-Money Laundering Group, SAMLAG. Such assessments should be conducted periodically as part of a review of strategies to curb cross-border crime. And as part of that, there should be common indicators to guide these assessments. And the assessments should be aligned with what the FATF has put in place and is using for mutual evaluation of anti-money laundering. The result would then be comprehensive mitigation strategies, which are reinforced by regional mechanisms. What I did in the paper was to identify some of these mitigation strategies. But really the starting point is to what are the main forms of economic crime, cross-border crimes that are so problematic to African countries. And here I made a categorization or a division between market-driven economic crime and predatory economic crime. And you see from the slide, which is on the screen now, that most of these involve commodities, the use of source countries, transit countries, and destination, or countries in which the actual marketing and raising of money actually happens. I will not go into detail in respect of any of these, but the importance of it is that it highlights the nature of the threat which cross-border collaboration has to respond to. And it also points to certain inherent vulnerabilities of the entities that may seek to activate cross-border collaboration. And I will return to one or two of these slides in due course. But the next issue is really to look at what affects capacity to activate international cooperation, whether we are talking of MLA or extradition. And here there are some identifiable sources of vulnerability. Firstly, the contamination of law enforcement and regulatory agents. And the main source of contamination is, of course, corruption. Secondly, whether the institutional frameworks are structured to effectively activate international cooperation, whether in a strategic sense, the entities, the agencies, the institutions that are expected to activate international cooperation are structured in a way that they will be able to do so. And related to that is the question of resources, whether the mandated structures are well resourced, because cross-border law enforcement is more costly than law enforcement on a purely domestic level, because of course it involves a lot more in terms of logistics. Then there is the question of accountability, which I think Olwethu did advert to as well, whether these mandated institutions are accountable. And this is a very important question when it comes to mitigation or what could be done to improve things. They will, in most instances, be accountable, that is, law enforcement and regulatory agencies. The question is who they are accountable to. If they are accountable to the same sort of corrupt political and economic elites who are at the heart of the problem, then you cannot expect that they will act in a way which is detrimental to the interests of their principals, so to speak. The next and related factor there is whether the state is able to regulate the economy. And here, focus is on regulating the activities of some of the potential sources of problems. And an example is easily to be located in the area of corporates, criminality that is committed by corporates or through corporate entities. If the corporate entities are not effectively regulated, certainly if the state is unable to identify who owns who is related to who in the corporate sector, then the state is then unable to effectively detect and investigate corporate criminality. The next factor there is whether the mandated authorities and agencies are able to access and to use international cooperation. And here, this is a function of the state of intergovernmental relations. Sometimes, if it may happen that the countries involved at two ends of the collaboration which is required do not get along for political or other reasons, that will almost certainly affect the effectiveness of any mutual legal assistance and extradition that they may seek to activate. Having said or highlighted some of those sources of vulnerability, let's just take a look at the key current mutual legal assistance and extradition initiatives on the African continent. Some of them are working effectively, others still need to be improved to actually perform the functions for which they were brought into being. There's a series or a set of informal initiatives listed on the left-hand column, in the left-hand column of the slide there. There are interagency, police agency collaboration as crystallized in IAPCO, SAPCO, WAPCO for the respective sub-regions. There is interagency revenue authorities collaboration crystallized in the Global Forum for the exchange of tax information on the African continent, activated in particular by the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF. Then there is interagency financial intelligence collaboration of all financial intelligence units that are members of the Egmont Group, and financial intelligence units which are within the ESAMLAG as a body of countries. And the ESAMLAG now comprises of 21 members, I believe. Then there are FIUs within the GIABA, which is the West African equivalent of ESAMLAG, the 16 member states of GIABA. Then there are bilateral information exchange agreements. Olwethu has already highlighted the role of WACAP for West Africa. There's also the International Association of Prosecutors and the African Prosecutors Association. Essentially, the common thread running through all these informal structures is that they bring together the actual practitioners of mutual legal assistance and extradition, whether they be prosecutors, investigators, financial intelligence agencies as well. They don't necessarily bring together the political actors, and they certainly do not bring together the economic elites. On the right, or in the right column, are your formal structures, UNCAC, UNTOC, the Great Lakes Judicial Cooperation Network, ECOWAS, SADC states with the various conventions and protocols that they have brought into effect there, IGAD for the Horn of Africa, the Lusaka Agreement, which really is confined to dealing with issues of trafficking, illegal fauna and flora, and the various bilateral treaties. So these are sort of the formal network. So it's not as if nothing is happening, so they do exist. But however, before any assessment can be made, we need to consider what are the main challenges that they have to deal with these informal and formal structures. There are two broad categories which are summarized in the table before you. They are capacity deficiency, and then the other category is that of the persistence of vested interests. Dealing first with capacity deficiencies, they take various forms, and they are encountered in most African countries. The first is responses to networked crime, which are not strategic. That has tended to be a common problem. The absence of any strategy guiding whether it be policymakers or practitioners in how they must respond to networked crime is really a big capacity deficiency. The second is inadequate capacity to enforce laws consistently and effectively, whether it's a question of resources or it's just a question of inadequate training. This is also a huge source of capacity deficiency. The third is systems for accessing, using, and managing relevant knowledge to detect networked crime and follow processes which are underdeveloped. Again, this is a huge capacity deficiency which runs right through the African continent, partly because of inadequacies of training or rapid staff turnovers, the more experienced practitioners being attracted out of the public service, leaving only the inexperienced, relatively relative novices to actually complex cases involving networked crime. Then the fourth capacity deficiency is inadequate capacity to investigate crime networks. That is also a common issue. When it comes to the persistence of vested interests, the most visible and most prominent vested interests are the corrupt political elites acting in collusion with equally corrupt or who are corrupted by economic elites. What that then takes affects the effectiveness of mutual legal assistance and extradition, especially extradition, because extradition, unlike MLA, tends to involve the executive authority at a very senior level in the form of the actual ministers of justice having to be involved in applications for extradition. Then there's the question of facilitative activities of enablers of money laundering and illicit financial flows. And some of these enablers are in the public sector, but most of them will be in the private sector. They are your professional intermediaries, lawyers, your accountants, your real estate brokers, and agents of various descriptions. These are, again, constitute part of the problem, which results in the persistence of vested interests. So the mitigation strategies really, in respect of the first lot of deficiencies and vested interest issues, to have law enforcement and regulatory agencies that are uncontaminated. How do we achieve that? Well, there will be various means and mechanisms to ensure that law enforcement and regulatory agencies are not contaminated. But that is part of the mitigation. The second is to have capable, knowledgeable, and well-resourced competent authorities. By competent authorities would be included your law enforcement, your regulatory agencies, would also include your resource, your revenue collecting authorities, the tax collectors. And then the third is informed regulation of the economy. And I refer just to corporate criminality, which if state does not actually manage what it established knowledge, does not manage the knowledge that it should have, which is pertinent to preempting and combating organized crime, it can be really in serious problems. Then finally is the question of accountable management of crime. I did say that the question of accountability is important because if the law enforcement authorities are only accountable to themselves or accountable to political elites and economic elites who are themselves corrupted, then they are not going to be effective in actuating MLA and extradition in Africa. So basically, the paper sort of did a collective overview of what is in place on the African continent. And the conclusion was that certainly we could do better. There are certain initiatives that have started, but we have not yet been able to really do an independent evaluation of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles, for sharing your findings with us. And I think one of the challenges is actually then to make sure that your findings get to the policymakers and law enforcement and prosecution agencies, so that we attend to all those shortcomings that you've identified. Thank you for that. Now it's time for the respondent, Mr. Daniel Brian Magagula, who will respond to the two presentations that we have thus far received. He'll be basing himself on his own experiences, practical experiences and expertise. Over to you, Mr. Magagula.
Thank you very much, Advocate. Yes, my job is not as big as our presenters, and I appreciate that I got to see their presentations beforehand. For me, really, the issue is to say what we experience at the ground, what is it that we see happening on the ground. Now, firstly, I would like to point out that the work of FSRBs like SAMALAG are very important in assessing the implementation of some of the tools that we have as jurisdictions to deal with organized crime. There is no doubt from the presentations, from the research, from the global initiative, that organized crime is a problem and it is growing, but at the same time, we need to deal with it effectively. Now, if you look at the mutual evaluation reports, the most recent ones that you'll find on the SAMALAG website, and then just scan through the reports and check on IO2 that relates to international cooperation to see how our countries are faring. In the region, if I speak, for instance, of Southern Africa, you will see that most of the countries there, we are either on a low level of effectiveness or moderate level. None of us really is doing well in ensuring that we cooperate internationally to deal with crime generally, but particularly organized crime. Now, the issue then is, why are we not performing? Because on the one hand, it's clear that organized crime is growing. At the other hand, we see that we have the tools. UNTOC is one of the most important tools because in those instances where there are no bilateral arrangements or agreements between states, UNTOC ought to be used to ensure that there is cooperation between states to deal effectively with criminality. Now, what we have found is that one of the major problems is a lack of response to requests, either extradition or mutual legal assistance requests. But the extradition part seems to be faring better. The most problematic area is with regards to mutual legal assistance. And what we've seen also, if you look through the mutual evaluation reports, you will see that most requests are actually mutual legal assistance requests, because most of the time you'll find that the investigating authorities, they are still trying to put the case together. They've identified certain evidence which is in a particular state, and they'll just like to bring that back. Or it could be related to asset recovery. So that's where we are having the biggest challenges, that is a lack of response. We've been checking to find lack of response, but is there a response, or do you get responses indicating why there was no response? And we have found that in most instances, when the requesting state makes the request and there is no response, there is usually no follow-up to check why has there been no response. Could it be that the request we have made does not meet, your local legal requirements, or whatever case may be? Now, what we have found is that the related problem to this is that there is no regular or even communication between the various competent or designated authorities in the various states. Because if we had such, interactions, regular interactions, then we would be able to, for instance, follow up. I sent you a request on this. How far have you gone? What are the issues? Is my requirement, my request meeting your requirements, those kind of things. So it is very important to ensure that as law enforcement authorities, we use the tools that are there for us to ensure that we deal with criminality. Criminality knows no borders. We have seen that we're basically in a global village. A criminal in Eswatini could be communicating to a criminal in Australia, as we speak, or South Africa could be communicating to someone, in Afghanistan as we speak. So they know no borders. And criminals generally, in as much as they might have protocols and how they communicate and all that, but they don't place impediments between them achieving what they want to do. So as law enforcement, we have been giving the tools to say, should you require to pursue a certain crime, or wherever they may be, whatever criminal, wherever they may be in the world, you should be able to use the particular tools that are placed at our disposal to ensure that we deal with criminality effectively. So how then should we remedy the situation? How should we as authorities, try to provide solutions? Firstly, a forum of this nature is very important. Global initiatives really should be applauded for this, because we should be assessing or analyzing whether the implementation of the tools is actually making an impact on the ground. So if the index keeps telling us that, no, crime is increasing, if there is an impact, it's only a small impact, then it means whatever efforts we're putting in are, not making the difference that we ought to make. So let's do the analysis on a periodic level, as Charles mentioned, to ensure that we check, because FSRB is like a summer lab. We'll be checking the implementation. Are you implementing? But the question next is there impact on the ground? And we can only know whether there is impact if we're able to make the assessment as this forum seeks to do. Now, going forward, beyond making the assessment of analysis, what else can we do? As authorities, we need to collaborate. Firstly, let's start from a domestic level. Each state should ensure that within own borders, there is strong coordination, interagency coordination, strong collaboration, the financial intelligence unit, the tax authorities, the police authorities. There is very clear channels of communication there, no limitations regarding the information that might be shared. We know, of course, that the intelligence department, but what we want in the long run is that you can convert intelligence to evidence. So let's use that to ensure that domestically we're able to coordinate as a state. Next leg, let's move to state. Our neighbors. Here I'm in Eswatini. There's Mozambique, there's South Africa. Let's collaborate. I should be in a position as I sit here to say there's a criminal that I want who has run away from Eswatini, who is now in Cape Town. I should be able to easily, call a colleague there to say, you know what, there's someone we're looking for, and we found that he's there. The formal processes will follow, because we need to follow the formal processes, but we need to enhance as well the informal, kind of processes, because we know that criminals are highly mobile. If you know you are wanted, you are not likely to be remaining in one place at the same time. So if we are able then to collaborate state to state, we're strengthening, our relations as neighbors to say no criminal will commit crime in one country yet and run to the other one and, feel that they are safe there, they won't be touched. Now, once we sort out the state collaboration, let's move now to regional. SADC, we say we have our own protocols as well, but we say now, listen, practically, we don't want criminality to get out of control within the region. So we have to collaborate as a region to ensure that if one part of the region requires a particular, evidence, information, requires a criminal who has run away, use the tools to ensure that we get the person back. So if we grow the cooperation from a domestic level, country to country, regionally, we are, increasing our effectiveness as far as ensuring that we use the tools that were at our disposal. Then lastly, we move now continentally. If we ensure that from each region of the continent, we have the cooperation which is very strong, and then now we cooperate at the continental level, we can deal with organized crime effectively. We have the tools, even in those situations where a particular state or region can indicate that, no, we don't have the tools, we have the UNTOC. It's there. If we have already, because we know that, fine, we have different jurisdictions. For instance, in our case, any international instrument has to be domesticated. We have domesticated UNTOC in the Prevention of Organized Crime Act, but there are those jurisdictions where you find that I think Rwanda is one of them, where an international instrument such as UNTOC forms part of their law, so they can actually refer to it and apply it, such that if they don't have any local, instruments, UNTOC is there to ensure that what you need to do to enforce the law is done accordingly. So in a nutshell, colleagues, that is what I can share from my end from our experience on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That's quite encouraging. Basically, we really need to have things right. Firstly, at the domestic level, at the level of the regions within our continent and broadly within the continent itself. Making sure that we are all at one, and making an assessment of how we're performing as a continent. How do we relate to each other's requests? How flexible are we? How rigid are we? How do we then try to smooth things out? This is very important. Now, may I hand over to Martin, who has been busy with the inter-regional agreements, and see how we are performing in that regard. Over to you, Martin. Please unmute yourself. You're muted.
Oh,
Thank you.
Sorry. I did, and I think the technical person sent that request again, which muted me. So I was saying that it is indeed a great pleasure for me to take the floor after the three previous speakers, because what I'm essentially going to be talking about will complement some of the things that have already been said, and especially continuing from what Daniel has just been saying. To mitigate some of the deficiencies of the existing architecture for international cooperation on criminal matters, since 2018, law enforcement organizations, the operational agencies responsible for the application of mutual legal assistance and extradition in Africa have resorted to alternative cooperation frameworks, including bilateral, trilateral, regional, sub-regional, international, and other operational cooperative arrangements that go beyond, and I say beyond, not subvert, the two traditional frameworks for international cooperation. By this, I'm referring to MLA and extradition. These arrangements have come as a result of various frustrations in the implementation of MLA and extradition arrangement, broadly speaking, internationally, but of course also in Africa. Charles' presentation and indeed the report before us have pointed out a number of concerning limitations in the application of mutual legal assistance and extradition frameworks in Africa. These frameworks have shown their limitations in terms of what Africa can implement because of their origin. So if you look at it, these frameworks have actually evolved from European legal practices, which have been universalized and codified in international law, particularly international criminal justice. So it is therefore possible that aspects of mutual legal assistance and extradition may be incompatible with aspects of African legal traditions, which, in my view, contribute to some of the deficiencies and challenges that Charles, Daniel, Olwethu have actually raised in their presentations. One of the biggest critiques of mutual legal assistance and extradition is that they have been heavily politicized and mired in bureaucratic processes that have made them cumbersome and difficult to implement. Charles calls it
vested interests, but indeed these are actually politics that countries play with this, even though international law exempt some of these crimes, especially serious crimes like terrorism and transnational organized crime, from politics. So they are politically exempted. But what we see in the application of this of this arrangement is that politics remains the guide. In some cases, political dynamics and mistrust have not only impeded the application, they have also hindered the ratification and entry into force of MLA and extradition arrangement in Africa. If you take, for example, the African Union has in the past 20 years been trying to finalize its mutual legal assistance and extradition agreement, but they remain as draft as we speak because of serious disagreement and mistrust among states. We also have some regional mechanisms like ENACT, which has also adopted this framework, but yet they remain to enter into force because of politics and what Charles referred to as vested interests. In the fight against certain universal crimes, including terrorism and transnational organized crime, international law does not only provide for international cooperation, it also obligates states to afford to one another the fullest or greatest measure of assistance. So the importance of the MLA and extradition arrangement cannot be overemphasized when it comes to the universal endeavor to eliminate these crimes. But politicking and bureaucratic bottlenecks have seriously undermined the critical role of this important agreement. Focusing on the interregional cooperation that we have seen recently, I would say since 2018, which have been drafted and negotiated by law enforcement agencies in East, West, and Central Africa. There are two main interregional agreements today involving 37 African states. The first is the agreement between West and Central Africa, which was adopted by chiefs of police in 2018, and it was endorsed by the head of state of West and Central Africa. However, that agreement is yet to enter into force because the head of state requested that they should be signed by the ministers. And because that's opened up the broader framework of the original agreement, negotiations have actually stalled for them to come into force. But there are new measures, there are new measures to revitalize this agreement, which we hope will soon come into force. The second agreement, the second interregional agreement is the agreement between Central and East Africa on cooperation on police and criminal matters. This agreement entered into force in October 2021, following its signature by ministers of security and police matters from 22 countries in Central and Eastern Africa. The two agreements are adopted within the broader cooperation system set up by Interpol and Afripol. Currently, 3 regions are involved in the application of these operational and practical agreement schemes. The main objectives of this interregional agreement are to facilitate operational cooperation on the ground and to eliminate politics in the fight against transnational organized crime, as well as to facilitate cross-border pursuit of criminal suspects. By opening up state borders to police operations, Interregional agreements are translating into reality the concept of policing without borders. In our age of cybercrime and growing phenomenon of borderless crimes, interregional agreements are the state response to which seeks to overcome some of the challenges with traditional frameworks of cooperation. These agreements are based on voluntary decisions of state that face common problems and seek to enhance law enforcement response to transnational organized crime. So these are the law enforcement officers themselves saying, we have faced problems and this is how we want to resolve them. It is truly, in every sense, an operational and practical agreement or arrangement by state. The goal is for countries, all the countries on the continent, to belong to one or more of these practical cooperation agreements to create and entrench the doctrine of policing without borders wherever criminality leads them. So we should have no bureaucratic, no political impediment to the way law enforcement fight crimes on the ground. That should only be determined by the technicalities on the ground and not by politics. The key features of this agreement include, there are 6 of them, or I would say 5 main ones. The first is the exchange and sharing of information and data among member states in the areas of criminal investigation, crime prevention, and general policing. The second key feature of this agreement is handing over criminal suspects within a maximum time of 8 working days. This again reconciles some of the challenges that we have in the extradition arrangement, where the first thing is about the right of state, which state has jurisdiction over what, and so on and so forth, which complicates the dynamics of fighting crime. In this case, we're talking of handing over criminal suspects. So if a state A happens to arrest a criminal from state B and state B requests for the handing over, state A must hand over that suspect within a maximum period of 8 days. The third key feature of this agreement is cross-border investigative missions across the participating regions, meaning that especially when we talk about the agreement between Central and Eastern Africa, investigative officers from any country in any part of the region can investigate across any borders, irrespective of regional borderlines, country borderlines, and so on and so forth, in pursuit of criminal suspect. This is extremely important. It was the heart of all of this agreement. The fourth key feature of this interregional agreement is common treatment of apprehended suspect and evidence. The countries participating in this agreement have agreed on certain basic criteria as to how they should treat apprehended suspect and evidence that they collect, and how to share those evidence with each other. The fifth major feature of this agreement is cooperation on tracking and arrest of wanted persons. Now, once a court in country A, for example, declares a person wanted, other countries within that framework, other countries that are participating in this agreement, if we take, for example, the Central and Eastern African Agreement, if country A declares a person wanted, all the 22 countries that form part of this agreement will activate that Interpol framework for wanted persons. And they are bound by this agreement to share that information with country A and to determine whether the suspect is in their countries or not, through intelligence sharing and other information. Another measure, what I see as a legal accomplishment when it comes to this agreement is that this agreement have tried to circumvent one of the key problems that we have in this mutual legal assistance and extradition agreement, which is the fact that some or I would say many of these agreements do not enter into force. They are adopted but not ratified because of various differences and various political interests. But what these interregional agreements have done to kind of really reconcile this problem is to include a clause which calls for the entry or for the temporal entry into force of this agreement while waiting or while pending ratification by member state. So these are the key features. These are not huge agreement. Again, the police were very clear that they wanted to address only the critical features of their work, what really impede their work from making progress in their effort to fight crime in Africa. We hope that other countries, as I said, that we have 37 so far that are participating. We hope that the other countries that are remaining outside this framework will be able to join or even sign a new interregional framework that suit them, because this is what they themselves negotiate and agreed upon, and they have to implement this instrument that they have adopted. In conclusion, I just want to state that ENACT has been supporting these processes as part of its mission to enhance Africa's response to transnational organized crime across the continent. I thank you very much, Chair, and I hope we can go into more details on some of these aspects during questions and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. There we are, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank all of you as the panelists for such lucid presentation and responses as well. Now it's open time for our questions and comments and answers that you should give. It's just to remind participants to fill in the evaluation forms, please, because we'd want to make sure that what we do does make an impact on our work. Therefore, the evaluation will assist us. Perhaps just to kick off, also I must thank ENACT, for this webinar, because the question of mutual legal assistance and extradition are very close to my heart, having been a Director General in the Department of Justice in South Africa, being a central authority, in terms of receiving all the requests and also making requests to other countries, as well as having been a National Director of Public Prosecutions. This has always been very close to my heart. But then there are also tensions, which I hope the panelists will be able to perhaps address. The tension between, national sovereignty and international cooperation, where because of international cooperation, you've got to let go of part of your sovereignty, to make sure that there is proper cooperation on these matters. And then also having to deal with different jurisdictions that we have, not only in Africa, but globally, where, the question then of the compatibility and complementarity of these legal systems, it becomes an issue. Perhaps that's something which the panelists might want to also address. Those who want to pose questions or make comments are free to do so. I hope I'll be assisted to be able to identify the hands of people who want to speak, or somebody will assist me insofar as that is concerned. But the platform is now open for engagement. Thank you. Perhaps whilst waiting for participants to raise their questions, can any member of the panel address the question of the tension between national sovereignty and international cooperation? Because once you decide to cooperate and collaborate at the global scale, there are certain things that you must let go in terms of your own sovereignty. So that's one tension. And then the various diverse jurisdictions in which we operate, some of which tend to operate to emphasize more on the question of human rights. Like, for instance, South Africa and Botswana and other countries, for instance, where in South Africa there's no death penalty. And then if you have somebody from Botswana who's in South Africa, you need to extract certain understandings from the authorities in Botswana. How do we deal then with those issues? There is a hand which I saw, which has since disappeared. But for now, can any member of the panel? Oh yes, Adib Sani has also got his hand up. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for this webinar. I must say, it has been a great learning curve for some of us who are already within the security space and working to sanitize our communities. I'm speaking from Ghana. Currently, all around us, there are some security challenges. Indeed, there's the need for regional and sub-regional cooperation. And I can say on authority that almost every regional and sub-regional body has, one form of protocol or another on transnational criminality. But the challenge has been commitment on the part of the state parties to implement some of these protocols that they have appended their signature to. Currently in Ghana, we have a serious challenge with organized criminals' ability to bring in weapons, small arms and light weapons that is used for criminality and, of course, conflicts. And currently we have about 350 unresolved chieftaincy and land disputes in Ghana. Some are also engaged in human trafficking, etc. But the focus for us right now is fighting terrorism. As you are well aware, Burkina Faso is one of the most affected countries by terrorism in the world. We are also close to Mali, Niger, etc. So the focus has been on fighting terrorism, and the criminal networks are taking advantage of the lack of attention on them to engage in their criminality. And I think that has been the challenge. So my question is, how do we balance the two, in as much as it is important to work towards preventing terrorism from spilling over from the Sahel region to the coastal areas, including Ghana, at the same time working to counter the threats of organized criminality, especially along our borders and all that. So, I mean, I'm a bit confused. How do we merge the two? How do we balance it? Which should we give priority over another? If we are going to work along the two, how do we go about it?
Okay, thank you, Adib. Would you like to respond? The colleagues on the panel?
I can respond.
Yes, Martin.
Yeah, I really want to thank Adib for that excellent question, which, yes, we did not address the issue of the nexus between organized crime and terrorism. but the two are together. Today, any country that claims to be fighting terrorism and is not addressing the issue of organized crime is not fighting terrorism. And any country that claims to be fighting transnational organized crime and is not looking at the nexus with terrorism, that country is still missing something. If you have seen the Organized Crime Index that I think Olwethu referred to at the beginning, one of the key findings of the index is the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism. The two have become so intertwined, terrorism and conflict, in such a way that you cannot really separate any of them. And this is where I support the United Nations resolutions, right, which have called on state to actually make provisions at the national level to fight the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism. What that basically means is, I would say, two things. One is to make sure that all the agencies that are involved in fighting these two forms of crimes must come together, and they must work together, and they must coordinate their activities together. The second area is that countries must also identify the nature or the extent to which organized crime is tapping into terrorism or terrorism tapping into organized crime, because the nexus differs from one country to the other. And I think that's also what the Security Council has emphasized in its resolutions, for countries to actually find out the nature and extent of the nexus, so that when you fight any of them, you know that you are fighting both. Because don't be oblivious to the other, thinking that you are focusing on terrorism. It's a pity to hear that in West Africa, the focus is on terrorism and not on organized crime. So how do terrorists get the arms? You answered the question really well. The procedure, the manner in which terrorists obtain these arms is through organized crime channels. So if you're not fighting organized crime, you're basically telling terrorists to continue to do their work. We've seen in Nigeria the involvement or the network between Boko Haram and bandit, right? And other organized crime groups. So you have to basically fight the two, and that means having the policy framework in place, and at the operational level, bringing the agencies together to harmonize and coordinate their activities.
Can I come in on this? Can I come in on this?
Yes, please do, Charles.
Thank you. I want to address the point that Advocate Pikoli made right at the beginning, and at the beginning, just after the Martin presentation. The question of the tension between national sovereignty and responding to requests, incoming requests from foreign nations. And that got me thinking. I think the case involving Manuel Chang, a former finance minister from Mozambique, brought this to the fore, not directly, but through some of the arguments that were put forward by civil society representatives from that country, from Mozambique, who were strongly arguing or supporting the case for Mr. Chang to be extradited, not to Mozambique, but to the United States. Curious though it may sound, but they strongly felt that if he was extradited to Mozambique, which was his home country, the chances were he was not going to stand a criminal trial there. I think the point really is, it revolves around accountability, which is one of the points I raised in my presentation. Who are these regulatory authorities and law enforcement and policymakers accountable to? If they are accountable to themselves, or if in the case of law enforcement agencies, they are only accountable to their political principles, then you are likely to find the argument of sovereignty being used almost as a shield to protect the probably criminally guilty from facing any sanctions at all. So the state will say, no, we have a policy of not extraditing our nationals. Some countries have even written it into their constitution. But the understanding is that if you don't extradite, then you should prosecute. But what one finds is that there's no extradition, there's no prosecution either. So in the end, the suspects get away with it. So to put it, but if they were accountable, not just to themselves or within the limited circles of the bureaucracy, but they were accountable to the public generally, then the public would in fact take them to task for failing to discharge their responsibilities, and in that process, protecting criminals. I think that raises that point. Related to that is the question of, it is so important and cannot be overemphasized that no country can respond adequately to organized crime without having a strategy to guide it. And in developing that strategy, the country will be able to identify what are the threats that we are responding to, and will also be able to map out comprehensively how to respond to those threats. And then that forms the strategy. So then you get rid of some of these sources of tension that then arise, or that may arise on an ad hoc basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Unfortunately, we are beginning to run out of time. According to my clock, we've got 4 minutes. I don't know whether the organizers have got some flexibility in terms of time. They will please guide me, Richard or Rumbi. But let's make use of the remaining minutes whilst the organizers will give us an indication. Any further comments, inputs,
Yes, Advocate.
questions?
I would like
Yes,
to add
yes,
what,
Daniel.
yes, please. I'd like to add on what Charles as well as Martin said. It is very important. I'd like to point out 3 things. The authorities in Ghana have to ensure that they strengthen the system. Firstly, by ensuring that there's adequate human, financial, and technical resources to deal with this problem. Secondly, they have to strengthen their domestic cooperation because this will be able to assist for investigation purposes. And lastly, they have to develop a strategy, a counterterrorism, as well as a counter-organized crime strategy. They have to determine how they will deal with this twin problem. Because if they're interrelated, we must have a way. How do we deal with the terrorism? How do we deal with the organized crime? But you'll have challenges if the system has not been strengthened sufficiently, and if there is no sufficient domestic cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I see a hand up. Alison, you may take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning from the UK, and thanks for the presentations. They were all excellent. My question is for Martin, if you would. So you mentioned in your presentation that a lot of the mutual legal assistance and extradition frameworks are essentially from European instruments, and that they might be incompatible with African legal systems. And I'm wondering, please, could you say a little bit more about that? Explain the ways in which they might be incompatible. I see this in the literature. It's a statement that's often made, but I don't understand it very well. So if you could say a little bit more, it'd be excellent. Thank you.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you very much, Alison, for that excellent question. I think my reference was to the fact that the current architecture of mutual legal assistance and extradition have evolved from the European legal practices, which to some extent, there are aspects which are incompatible with the African legal traditions. And one, for example, is the extreme bureaucratic nature of the mutual legal assistance, which it makes it too cumbersome. In some cases, countries just give up the process. You have to do that. You have to write the letter in this way. You have to, the request has to go to this person. If you look, for example, the South African International Corporation on Criminal Matters Act, it explains all sorts of procedures of how this request need to go, who need to treat what, at what point it goes to who, and all that bureaucratic process. It's in many ways cumbersome for the simplistic African approach to some of these things, and especially for the law enforcement officers on the ground who do not understand some of this over literature stuff. They want things to be as direct, to be in black and white. This is what we want, and this is how we want it. When we now go into all of these processes, especially the extradition arrangement, we first of all have to decide who has jurisdiction over what. And then if after deciding even on that, like Charles has just talked about the case of Chang, political issues will come into play. Yes, human rights issues. We cannot send this person to you because we are afraid that you know your legal system is not compatible with ours. You have death penalty, we don't have, and therefore so all of these create things that are not really, I would say, fit into the African framework.
Okay. Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you very much, Alison, for that question. I'm advised by the organizers that that was the last question. We simply have got to make UNTOC work, not only for Africa, but for the global community. We do have that obligation. And I would like to again thank all the presenters for their very lucid and brilliant papers. And then also thank everybody else on the platform, and thank ENACT for having organized, this webinar. I think it will go a long way towards ensuring that UNTOC does not become a convention on paper, but is practicalized on the ground. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope we have been able to fill in the evaluation forms. Please don't forget. Thank you very much.
Thank you.